Can't hear anything.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's members' talk. My name is Neil Chassor. I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, and it's great to see so many of you in this evening. Thanks for joining. Before I hand over to Anne-Marie Akehurst, the Society's Programmes Officer, I'll just run through a few parish notices, as is customary. Oh, forgive me, I've gone to the end of my slideshow, do bear with me. There we are, that's better, good. Right, so first of all, just to say that if you're not a member of the Society already, membership is the simplest and easiest way of supporting our educational mission. We're hugely grateful for any support, and we value our members enormously. If you'd like to know more about what we do and how to join, please visit our website at sahgb.org.uk/support-us. We do a huge amount. We're doing more than we ever have. We have a whole host of features which we've been commissioning over the summer, which you can find on our knowledge page. This is just to give you a flavour of the range of subjects we've been dealing with, from London's queer nightlife to the post-war AA, to Beirut and heritage issues. There's all sorts there. We also produce a magazine twice a year, exclusive to the membership. This issue just completed, should be with members in the next couple of weeks, and includes a feature by our speaker this evening. So again, do consider joining us to get that particular member benefit, and also our journal, Architectural History, Volume 63. The finishing touches are just being put to the journal now, and that should be with members soon. In terms of events, we've had an incredibly busy programme of events since lockdown began in March. We have one more in our seminar series this calendar year. On the 7th of December, Christine Casey will give a paper on surface values, ways of seeing decoration in architecture. And this evening, of course, is the second of our members events on the arts and crafts. We had a talk by Anne Stutchbury last week on Standen, and on the 9th of December, Esme Walker will speak on Barn Close and the evolution of the Arts and Crafts House. And we'll carry on this mini series of events on the arts and crafts into early 2021. Exciting things in the offing. You can register for those events on our website at sahgb.org.uk/what's on, and you can also register there for the annual lecture and award ceremony on the 14th of December. And as many of you will know, this is normally the kind of social highlight of our calendar, and so we have had to reinvent the format virtually. So what we thought we'd do is host a sort of fireside with our annual lecturer, Dr. Lynn Walker, with her friend and collaborator, Elizabeth Darling, and in the hope that we will be able to have some sort of hybrid event at which Lynn will deliver her lecture at some point in early 2021. So instead, we'll have this broadcast discussion about her research and writing, about her exhibitions, and that will follow a short ceremony presided over by Neil Jackson, at which we will announce the winners of the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion. I'm showing you the shortlisted titles here. The Colvin Prize for the best work of reference in architectural history, the Hawksmoor Essay Medal, and the James Morris Prize for critical post-colonial perspectives on architecture and the British Empire. And we've had a bumper year of submissions to all of those prizes, some really fascinating work, diverse in subject matter, and do join us to hear the results of those competitions in December. And we should have a number of interviews between the president and the shortlisted authors of the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion going up on our social media channels and YouTube shortly, and we will write to members as and when that happens. Finally, just to flag that I'm still accepting applications for communications officer and digital officer, two absolutely vital roles to the running of the society, in particular as we are all living our virtual lives at the moment. And especially because we have a lot coming up by way of communications. We have a podcast series that is currently being developed by Jessica Kelly, and we have various other things in the offing too. So if you or you know anybody who has skills and experience in these areas, do please get in touch. It would be hugely appreciated. You can email info@sahgb.org.uk to reach us. So over to Anne-Marie to introduce this evening's talk.
Thank you, Neil. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Alec Hamilton to you tonight. I know that we have many people who've joined this evening who are particular friends and associates of Alec, so I'm sure you'll be delighted to see him there. And he's been very proactive in promoting this, for which we thank him. And just once again to reiterate, if you're not a member, please join. It's the best way you can support us and maintain our promotion of architectural history in its broadest possible sense. So Alec had said earlier on today that he would prefer not to have one of the standard biographical, sort of delivering his CV to everybody. So I'm not going to say very much about him. Many of you will know him already. He has had a presiding, a preoccupation with arts and crafts since 2004, when he first did a BA dissertation and then continued with his MA studies. This was all after a career in advertising, and you may get a taste of that because I know that he has something he's particularly interested to promote this evening, which is his new publication on the Arts and Crafts Church. If you haven't already noticed, we've been very fortunate to negotiate a discount with Lund Humphreys. And if you want to purchase his book, and I'm sure there'll be more mention of it during the talk, then you go back to the invitation that you've clicked on now, the Zoom invitation, and the discount code has been included there. So that will give you 20% off. Anyway, so after his career in advertising, Alec has studied, researched, and in particular has developed this knowledge base on this category called the Arts and Crafts Church. And without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce 1900 Lions and Lambs, the Irresistible Rise and Bashful Demise of the Arts and Crafts Church. Over to you, Alec.
Hi, good evening and welcome, and thanks for coming. I hope you can hear me and see me. I'm just going to get rid of myself. My talk is called Lions and Lambs, the Irresistible Rise and Bashful Demise of the Arts and Crafts Church. I got rid of myself because I find it very irritating and distracting to have the speaker visible, and I go very fast and I don't want you to see me as I'm working. So good evening. This is not my first talk online on Arts and Crafts Churches. In October, I did a talk for VICSOC called Arts and Crafts Churches. So this talk is a kind of follow-up to that, Arts and Crafts Churches too, but it is self-contained and it is freestanding. When society asked me first to do this talk, they assumed I would just revamp the VICSOC talk, but I felt that would be shortchanging the society and frankly a bit dull for me. What else was I doing in lockdown? Much more interesting to do something new, so I said I will do entirely different churches, and so I am. The good news is you can still see the VICSOC talk. It was recorded and is available forever on the VICSOC website. You go to their website and you click that and you will get the talk. It does cost a £5. But I thought, as some of you may not have seen that, it's just conceivable, I would just give you a quick rundown of the churches I talked about to the VICSOC, because I ain't going to talk about these tonight. I'm going to talk about entirely different churches. So here they go. I talked about these, and if you think you want to know more about these, go to VICSOC. St Christopher's Hazelmere, Good Shepherd Dockenfield by Curtis Green, St Michael and All the Angels Woolmer Green by Robert Weir Schultz, the only Weir Schultz surviving church in England, St Mary the Virgin by Lutchins, an early and rather unregarded work of his, St Mary Dale Road Buxton by Curry and Thompson, and an earlier church by Percy Curry on his own at Stonebrim in Derbyshire, St John the Baptist by Charles Nicholson near Witney with his extraordinary holly green and carmine interior, Charles Memorial Church in Port Seaton, the Unitarian Church in Wallasey with painted furniture by Bernard Slay, St Agatha Landport with graffiti by Hayward Sumner, St Matthew's Church Paisley, Hermon Calvinistic Methodist Church in Cymru, Llanarmon Dyffryn Ceiriog, Powys, Sacred Heart Aberlour, St Basil Derry Tend, Edward VII Sanatorium Midhurst, and Mount Vernon Hospital in Northwood. So all of those, there's the whole list. You're not going to hear about those tonight. That's it. So if you didn't see my VICSOC talk, go there, and for a £5 you can see it. And jolly good fun it is too. However, tonight is the only chance you have to hear this talk. So I'm only going to say this once. But as we go along, can you please devise and submit difficult questions, because that's the best bit of the talk is questions at the end, and the worse the questions, the better. Here are the churches I'm going to talk about tonight. Be warned, I'm going to keep this fairly light because I think online talks should be entertainment as much as, even more than, a lecture. But as this is the Society of Architecture Historians, it will be serious too, and I hope provocative. Definitely contains a number of provocations. And as Anne-Marie has mentioned, it's all well, pretty well all in my book, Arts and Crafts Churches, published by Lund Humphreys in September. And you can buy it on the Lund Humphreys website, or using the link on your email, your joining email, with that code, and you get 20% off just in time for Christmas. What a treat. Yes, Crafts20 is the code. And there's the website. That's the book you're buying. Very good. Right, that's the end of the commercial. This talk is in 4 sections. The first is Arts and Crafts at Embryo. I'm going to look at precursor churches, that is, churches built in the 1870s that foreshadow features that later come to characterize the arts and crafts in church building. Secondly, in excelsis, churches built around 1900, which I'm taking for tonight's talk to the peak of the arts and crafts in churches. It's a slight construct, slight fabrication. I'm not sure it's actually true, but it works for tonight, and it's a good title for the talk. So 1900, the zenith, the apogee of arts and crafts churches. Section 3, in memoriam, the long diminuendo of the arts and crafts, tied up with grief after the Great War and the slight sense that the optimism of the arts and crafts became irrelevant, even embarrassing, and then questions. Okay, well, 1900 is a pretty important year. My thesis, which I finished in 2016, was called The Arts and Crafts in Church Building in Britain, 1884 to 1918. And I used those dates because 1884 is the founding of the Art Workers Guild, where arts and crafts ideas first emerged as ideas. And 1918 is the end of the Great War, when church building stopped expressing optimism and became almost entirely about memorializing. So 1900 comes about midway, sort of pivot in the arts and crafts between 1884, when it sort of begins, and 1918, when it sort of ends. Of course, the reality is different. It does not start one fine day, it does not finish one dark night. But I thought for this talk, it would be instructive to use 1900 as the moment when whatever was new and exciting about arts and crafts in the 1880s, 1890s, turned towards becoming something faintly ridiculous. Betjeman has said in 1933 that by 1912, arty craftiness became an expensive joke. For in 1933, there was modernism, flat roofs, rationalism, social engineering, logic, facts and figures. Away then with arts and crafts, whimsy and nostalgia, and oldie England, and simple-minded liberalism, and good-hearted honesty and fun. I also had the idea that 1900 allowed me to say that 1884, the churches came in like a lion, and in 1918, they went out like a lamb. But of course, the reality is different. 40 years is not very long in architectural history, and it's more realistic to say it all happened at once. Now, although I've said there's an arc of development from 1884 to 1918, the reality is that arts and crafts was not linear. There is diffusion, not progression. The architects did not want to emulate previous generations. They did not worship the past. They did not even want to copy each other. They admired and respected each other, but they did not follow anybody. So it does not proceed in an orderly fashion. It does not really proceed at all. So what did happen in those 40 years? Okay, section 1, the precursor churches. I want to start by looking at some of the churches that came in the 1870s, the decade before the 1884. I want to get you to see that what we think of as an arts and crafts church has its origins rather earlier. I want to get you to look with arts and crafts spectacles. Now then, what do those spectacles do to your eyes? What was it about the arts and crafts mindset that was different from what had gone before? In his book, Arts and Crafts Architecture, Peter Davey suggests this: arts and crafts people shared Morris's affection for simplicity, truth to materials, and the unity of handicraft and design. To which I am bold enough to add the following generalizations: a distrust of the machine-made, a preference for the handmade, and when it came to churches, a fastidious dislike of the bought-in or off-the-shelf, or anything from church furnishers' catalogues. There was a cooperative spirit in the work. They were friendly with each other. They weren't competitive, as the Goths were. And there was the personal. They liked to think for themselves. They liked to feel for themselves. They liked to be themselves. And they were rejecting the way in which they'd been trained in large offices, suppression of individuality, discouragement of initiative, and a sort of design slavery. All of that was rejected by the arts and crafts. So, in embryo, precursor churches, things that came before what we might describe as an arts and crafts church. Okay, well, the St. Mary Wreay is so famous, it has its own biography by Jenny Uglow. And clearly it cannot be arts and crafts because it's, by date, it's 40 years too early. And in terms of reference, in 1842 as a church, it was completely new and unfamiliar. Sarah Losh built it as a memorial to her sister Catherine. She added hints, we are told, of a lost lover killed on the northwest frontier. She gave the land and the money on condition that I should be left unrestricted as to the mode of building it. Stone carving on the exterior includes butterflies, birds and beetles, coral and ammonites in the window openings, and grotesque oversized animals and monsters. We are a long way from the Gothic revival. Other motifs in the church include arrows, pine cones, vines and lotus flowers. Gavin Stamp described it as proto-arts and crafts. The chancel arch is surmounted by a vision of heaven as a wooden beam, a row of angels and palm trees. There's no rood and there's no crucifixion. The pulpit is a single bog oak tree trunk, carved to look even more gnarled. Is this naively vernacular or wildly over-sophisticated? There are two reading desks, an eagle and what we are told is a pelican. There are naturalistic carvings on the pew ends and door jambs, and as wall sconces an owl and a cockerel. The design details seem to have no antecedents. High windows in the east overlaid with alabaster cutouts of fossils. The marble altar rests on two giant bronze eagles. There are more naive grotesques in the capitals. And the font was carved from alabaster by Sarah and her cousin William Septimus Losh. On its cover, water lilies float on a mirror. Gauche, romantic, naive, or naff. And here is Sarah herself, or possibly her sister, as a corbel. Some see the symbolism as more natural history than Christian, or proto-scientific, but there's no suggestion that religion and science are at odds, because they are not. Nor much evidence of Christ the Redeemer. There is no crucifix in the church. You can see at the back Agnus Dei and some emblems of the apostles, where they were added in the 1890s or 80s, not quite sure when. Dante Gabriel Rossetti thought that Sarah Losh must have been a really great genius and should be better known. And he urged Philip Webb to go and see the church, but alas, there's no evidence that he did. Anyway, Wreay is sort of grudgingly allowed to count, even though it's an oddity, even if it doesn't quite fit. But you can see that some of the things that come out in the arts and crafts later are incipient in this church. But now I want to venture into much more debatable territory. Churches that no one thinks have anything at all to do with the arts and crafts except me. I do, and I want you to try and see if you can see it too. First of all, a church by Henry Woodyer, St. John the Evangelist at Twinstead in Essex. Woodyer was a pupil of William Butterfield, whose All Saints Margaret Street was completed in 1859. The old Pevsner describes the interior as a red brick with a wild admixture of black and yellow brick decoration outside and with bands and trellis inside, all very much in the style of Butterfield. Woodyer got more and more interested in polychrome decoration as his career progressed. But at this early date, he is restrained and clear-eyed. Yes, it is decorative, but it is sober, even regimented, more Mondrian than William Morris. A red and black blind arcade dominates the nave. Above is a lattice of yellowy brown brick. There's more coloured brick towards the chancel end, and blue and red tiling in the sanctuary. And now the font and font cover. Are they clumsy interpretations of the medieval, or are they pointing forward to something else, more thrillingly, more studiedly simple? The dove counterweight to the font cover is almost a cartoon. We're sort of halfway between high Victorian correctness and something wilder and freer. I don't think Woodyer would have seen himself as the forerunner of anything, let alone the arts and crafts. But this stripped down, pugnacious, uncompromising look is something that crops up elsewhere later. Another precursor now, not consciously so, of course, but I submit unconscious. Something is on the way. St. Peter Hornblotton, Somerset by Thomas Graham Jackson. At first sight, nothing very remarkable. What are we doing here? But inside, as is so often the way, there is new energy. Sgraffito work in strawberry and cream, as the English Heritage Listing describes it. When you mention sgraffito, people tend to say in the arts and crafts, oh, Hayward Sumner, because that's who they've heard of. But this is way too early for Sumner, because in 1872, he was 19, studying law in London. It was all actually designed by Jackson himself, a rather conventional, even predictable architect, Anglo-Jackson, as Betjeman called him. And the work was carried out by two craftsmen, Francis Wormleton and Owen Gibbons, who were amongst the sgraffito makers who worked on the murals in what is now the V&A in the 1870s. But the thing that drew my eye was the woodwork in the altar, and here, strikingly, in the choir stalls, naturalistic birds, inlaid and stained, energetic, naive, life-enhancing, light-hearted, a hoopoo, both domestic and exotic all at once. These are not stylized or generalized as they would have been in 1850 or indeed 1350. They are living, real, natural. This is surely new, and the arts and crafts constantly reproduce the natural world in church interiors. The Benedicite allows all sorts of living creatures to be depicted. You know, O ye mountains and hills, bless ye the Lord. That has lots of references to wild animals, and the arts and crafts use it a lot as a theme in their interior decoration. The next church is a kind of missing link. It's St Mary the Virgin, Houghton Green, Denton, northeast Manchester, by the Middleton tailor and his brother Henry in the 1874. It's said by local historians to be inspired by a nearby surviving late medieval wooden church, St Lawrence of 1531. And in 1872, it was enlarged by the tailors. They added new chancel and what are described as transepts. And the next work was this church nearby. It's a sort of medieval wayside chapel, struggling not to be Gothic. It wants to be something else, but it does not quite know what. The little sandstone tower attracts particular adverse comment. Nothing about it is correct. It's the kind of thing that gets the word eclectic attached to it. You might see the influence of the aesthetic movement in those, can they be sunflowers? If you like classification, you might like to have a go at the lectern on the left. And here is the pulpit, and the font. I'm sorry, I've jumped ahead. The pulpit is there. Let's go back to the font. The font starts off solidly Gothic at the base, but those flowers, can they be lilies? Are they aesthetic too? Here is the pulpit, but it's the incidental details that I sense something new coming through. This is not George Bankhart plasterwork, but it's going in that direction, naturalistic, slightly primitive, slightly cat-handed. And here's more of that naturalistic nature work. Carved this time, naive, a little crude, but fresh. You can call this clumsy, a sort of failed Victorian ecclesiology or a misguided attempt to be medieval, but then that's what Morris & Co. were trying to do too. The conventional wisdom is that it's all a bit amusing and crackpot. But with your arts and crafts spectacles on, can you see how it might be foreshadowing something that will emerge very soon, but with more certainty, better ideas, better craftsmen, better sense of direction? These details, I've shown them of their context to make the point, are halfway between naive and knowing. If I told you the gesso panel under the west window at the top was by someone who later showed by the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, or a follower of the Glasgow School, you might look at it differently. And is this a Morris window? That church compares with a number of slightly later rural churches in the same free vernacular spirit. St John's, John Douglas's St Michael Altcar of 1878, and Edmund Kirby's St John's at Highley in Knutsford of 1893. And this has echoes too. St Luke's Tittensor by Thomas Roberts, again a bit early to be the genuine article, and by someone who had no artistic connections whatever. He was a member of no guild. He was plain Thomas Roberts, estate architect to the Duke of Sutherland. The porch has square, proud, round pegs. Are these a careful touch of the knowingly vernacular, or is it just the way they did things in rural Staffordshire at this time? There is something playful and even skittish in the stone and brickwork. The choir stalls are halfway between heavy Victorian and something more light-hearted, and the same goes for the rest of the woodwork. It's not Gothic, but what is it? It's transitional. Well, we can see that now. Well, I can, but where is it all heading? These churches of the late 70s are no longer Gothic revival, but nor are they yet as arty and sophisticated in their simplicity as what comes a little later, which leads us on to a church which somehow seems to be unquestionably arts and crafts, if not pre-Raphaelite. And this is because it is by Philip Webb, friend of William Morris, revered by Letherby and admired by all. I do not see much to remark in this interior, except that it is bolder and bigger than what we've seen before. But that was because the client, George Howard, Earl of Carlisle, was very, very rich. The space is wide and open, emphasized by the white painted ceiling. The two aisle roofs are wholly different. Why? And with no clear story, but instead tiny dormers. This is the north aisle from the outside. Sorry, yes, the north aisle from the outside. The reredos is by Hicks and Charwood, 1928, incorporating a gesso panel from an original Morris scheme. You constantly read the church has no pulpit, but it does. Well, there are reading desks on both sides, and they are not connected with the choir stalls. They were designed by Webb to the instructions of Henry Whitehead, the incumbent. They're not terribly exciting. The main attraction, of course, is the Morris glass, which is everywhere. Morris at his richest, with comfortable womanly angels by Burne-Jones. Whitehead insisted on Morris glass and foresaw its reputation. The time will come, he said, when strangers will seek Brampton for the windows in St. Martin's Church. There is no crucifixion or judgment, but the virtues, biblical heroes, the Good Shepherd and paradise. All is pretty much as Howard, Whitehead and Webb intended. But take away the glass, and does it really lead anywhere? More controversy, more provocation, as promised. St Hilda Cross Green, Leeds by J.T. Micklethwaite in 1876. And Micklethwaite was a member of the Art Workers Guild very early, 1884, not a founder, but he joined in the first year, was asked to join in the first years. But St Hilda was built before the Art Workers Guild existed, so it is a precursor. The outside is in this frowning red brick, rather daunting, in a Gothic revival style, according to the Historic England listing. But inside, the impression is very different, pale, watery, high and spacious, and with woodwork painted in a variety of interpretations of medieval styles. Micklethwaite is turning away from Gilbert Scott and the Gothic revival. In his book, Modern Parish Churches, 1874, he condemned over-pedantic antiquarianism and vulgar professionalism. The Church Times called the church large, lofty and dignified, with no stint of space in any direction. Its glories are in its furnishings. The font and pulpit, 1882, are both by Micklethwaite, and he had plans for a high screen with a singing gallery, but there was no money. But there was a rood screen being crossed by 1904, and to Micklethwaite's design. It is not there now. Was made by a local man, William Horsman Reynard, who lived round the corner in St Hilda's Road, a printer's or possibly painter's joiner, according to the 1911 census, and he made the screens across the north and south aisles in 1915. Micklethwaite died in 1906, and the Reynard Rood was replaced in 1921 by a new screen and loft based on Micklethwaite's design by William Henry Wood, the Durham-Doston architect. The carved figures are by Alfred Southwick, who was an Art Workers Guild member from 1934, later, long after this church was finished. The screen was made by Chadwick and Ibbotson of Leeds and painted by 7 members of the congregation. It's a very arts and crafts church that members of the congregation are given brushes and go up into the loft, and here we are in the loft now, and paint different bits, well, to their own design or guided by Wood, or may have been drawings by Micklethwaite, I don't know. But you can see it's kind of careful, it's kind of slightly amateur, and it's a bit of a mixture and a bit of a muddle. But it is a loft big enough to perform, Easter ceremonies if that's what you want to do. And I feel these are personal expressions of the members of the congregation. Now, the panels in the screen were inserted in 1924, carved by a man called James Ogleby, a stone carver of Newcastle, and painted by Stanley Watkins. But you see, it's 1924. Oh, it's too late. It's too late. It's become something else. I'm not quite sure what. Insincere, twee, inept, not the real thing. Speaking of which, St Michael and All Angels, Bedford Park, Norman Shaw, 1878. Still really too early to be really arts and crafts. The colour scheme, green seating, terracotta walls and white ceiling was all Shaw's, and the panelling red, dark red in the chancel came in 1881. Much of the work from Shaw's designs was carried out by Maurice Adams, an assistant in Shaw's office, and he was the first churchwarden of the church. His font arrived in 1884, and he designed the pulpit in 1894, along with other things, clock and sanctuary floor and all that kind of stuff. To some, it seems almost like a church hall. It's a jovial, theatrical, come-as-you-are sort of place. Andrew Saint called it a comfortable auditorium where independent, clear-thinking folk can watch the enactment of the Lord's Supper without loss of self-respect. In short, something quite happily secular. You don't get that in Gilbert Scott churches. And of course, it seems much less mannered in the workaday choir vestry. Now to a church that I keep being told is not arts and crafts. St Catherine, Hoarwithy, Herefordshire, by John Pollard Seddon. But as you see from the dates, it straddles 1900. So by date, it's a church built around 1900. Does that make it arts and crafts? Well, let's have a look. In the 2012 Pevsner, Alan Brooks calls it the most impressive Victorian church in the county. The inspector for what was then English Heritage in 1987 was bedazzled and declared it in the listing Rundbogenstil with Byzantine, French, Venetian, Lombardic, Tuscan and Sicilian Romanesque influences. William Poole was the vicar of Hentland, and he owned land all over the country and used the rents to beautify Hoarwithy Church. His architect was John Pollard Seddon, a dependable man who produced 31 new churches, mainly in Monmouthshire, Glamorgan and Herefordshire. The church was a commissioner's church of 1840. It was not pulled down. Its walls were encased in new sandstone. Poole and Seddon added this claustral walk to the south, a distinctly exotic thing to find in rural Herefordshire. And they jazzed the whole thing up with eye-catching carving, much of it unorthodox and original. Drip mouldings end with a hand, another holding a bird, a snail, and grotesque heads. Around the west doorway, there are motifs that echo 12th century Kilpet, which is just 8 miles away, but with greater regularity and I think rather less verve. The major structural elements were finished by 1883, and in some cases, stonework remains yet unfinished. Inside, it is gaudy in every detail. The east end is overseen by a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, designed by Ada Curry for Powell's and installed in 1893. The chancel columns are red-veined grey marble on Egyptian porphyry bases. The altar is white marble inlaid with lapis lazuli, and the central cross of tiger's eye. Oh my goodness. The pulpit is of white marble with panels of red and green. The choir stalls on the north side seem to have come from somewhere else. They fit rather badly, but on the south side, they strike a somewhat rumbustious note. They were carved by Harry Hems of Exeter to designs by Seddon. Poole's niece recorded that the walls were to have been decorated in harmony with the roof, of which the ceiling, king posts and tie beams had been decorated by Mr. George Fox, who had a scheme for the walls, which my uncle intended to carry out had he lived, as funds became available. So you can imagine what an extremely vivid and colourful church it would have been. The West End glass designed by Seddon in 1890 to 96 in very pale colours was based on something that Poole saw in Bordeaux Cathedral. In a way, here it was Poole who was most arts and craft in spirit. Nothing was shop bought, all was fine quality work, nothing but the best for his flock, and highly personal, a maverick, individual view of God and worship. If there must be a first, an arts and crafts church, Leek is perhaps the prime contender, and it's just after 1884. It ticks a number of boxes. It was designed by Richard Norman Shaw, from whose offices came the founders of the St. George's Art Society, the forerunner of the Art Workers Guild. Much of the decorative interior is by 2 of the Art Workers Guild's founders, who went on to have architectural careers of their own. Much of the work was done by local craftsmen and women. Shaw delegated much of the oversight of the work to his assistant W.R. Letherby, who'd spotted as a talented draftsman in 1879. Letherby designed and made the font and the pulpit. Another Shaw assistant, Gerald Horsley, who was Art Workers Guild from 1884, a founder, decorated the chancel. The reredos was designed by Letherby and painted by F. Hamilton Jackson, Art Workers Guild, 1887. So this might be Burgess or Bodley. But the glory of the church is the Lady Chapel. The east wall was painted by Horsley in this slightly tentative pre-Raphaelite vein. And the rest of the walls were painted 20 years later, 1913 to 16, during the Great War, by a Leek man, John Edgar Platt, who was a member of the Art Workers Guild from 1929, after he'd finished this work. Heron, magpie, mallard and swallows flocked to St. Francis, and a pigeon, kingfisher and peacock have got there first. More of the natural world, very naturalistically painted. In the sanctuary, there is this painted Episcopal chair. I do not know who painted it, and I wish I did. If anyone knows, I'd love to know. You can see it's in the spirit of artsy craftsy, but it somehow isn't quite right. Is it somebody more recently trying to keep in sympathy with it? I'm not quite sure. I'd like to know more about this. There's lots of glass. The Jesse window is a Morris Company job, 1923, to old Burne-Jones designs. And this window of the three women, Miriam, Esther and Ruth, is also by John Edgar Platt of 1912. I think to some extent the best window in the church, although I don't like giving marks out of 10, but I think it's the one that kind of catches your eye. Finally, in this group of precursors, something that dates from just after 1884, but nonetheless feels like something rather earlier. It's the Founders Chapel at St. John the Evangelist Mission in Marston Street in Oxford, by C.C. Rolfe, 1887. It's the chapel of the founders of the Cowley Fathers mission. The main buildings and church are by Bodley. All that stuff in the front is 1894. And in the back, the very high pitched roof is the original Founders Chapel, high above Master Street, which served the community when it first started. It is austere, ascetic, bare and stripped back. It expresses rather vividly some of those key arts and crafts values of simplicity, truth to materials, a preference for the handmade, and a dislike of the off-the-shelf. And in a monastic context, the cooperative spirit is manifest and is also the personal. Somehow, though severe, it is yet welcoming, comforting. And that then is the run-up. Glimpses, hints, if you look at the right way, of what is to come. So, what I'm calling in excelsis, churches built around 1900, churches that have confidence in being different. They know that they're different. They know in what way they're different and that it is important to be different. They glory in their difference, originality and individuality. But perhaps above all, they express that art is becoming more important than religion, or more important than God. This is a church in Lower Kingswood, Surrey, by Sidney Barnsley, the only completed church he built, although he did adapt a small chapel much later in 1925. But this is his only church he completely designed and built himself. It's a deliberate evocation of academically analysed Byzantine architecture. This had not happened before in Anglican church building. It predates Westminster Cathedral by 4 years or so. The church manages to be very English, yet nonetheless oddly foreign. A freestanding campanile stands on one side, based it seems on one in Bulgaria. But inside the exoticism is even greater. Dove-coloured marble and gold mosaics. Don't let anybody tell you the arts and crafts is all about simplicity. Sometimes it's all about bling. The cultural presiding genius was a lawyer, Edwin Freshfield, and the church is vividly dedicated to Freshfield. A memorial mosaic to him and his family was installed before his death, at about the time of his wife's death in 1902. Barnsley was just starting out on his career. He was hands-on, very arts and crafts, and according to his friend Wreay Schultz, he lived on the spot and personally superintended the work in every detail. He's even supposed to have camped in the churchyard, and he painted the roof here with his own hands, apparently to a design by Mrs. Freshfield. It's not clear whether Barnsley himself made any of the furniture in the church, though he may have designed it. In 1893, the studio enthused, finding it handled with a reticent feeling and sense of proportion, beyond praise. Nothing jars one's sense of well-ordered harmony. It is emphatically the work of an artist rather than of a professional man. You'll notice no comment whatever on how it works as a church. Here's more art. St. Mark Brithdir Dolgellau by Henry Wilson. Built by Louisa Tooth, returned from Florence, wealthy and widowed, in memory of her second husband. Mrs. Tooth wrote to the ecclesiastical commissioners, "I am anxious to build a small church of Brithdir, as all the district is so far from a church, and the people are simply given to dissent." Hardly surprising in Wales. The intention was yet higher. A rude beam was proposed, but this did not happen. Wilson's idea was Italian. I have constantly in mind one or two of those delightfully simple churches just south of the Alps, where all the effect comes from the management of the light and the proportions of the roof and the walls, while probably no detail will be exactly like any Italian church I know. The altar frontal was modelled and the whole chased by William Wilson himself. The Annunciating Angel looks to me rather like a flower fairy. Wilson had great trouble with the model, who would not keep still. It seems rather strange. He had a small boy to model for this, and he was chasing it from the life. And, well, does it look like a small boy to you? The pulpit with its copper panels perturbed Mrs. Tooth, who feared it would look like a flower pot, but it doesn't. The doors are to a design by Wilson. I've tried to decide what kind of style that is. Is it Moorish? I don't think I know enough about Middle Eastern art. It doesn't seem very Italian to me. But he relied on Trasks of Norton-sub-Handon for the detailed carving. There had been John Dando Sedding's favourite carver, and Wilson, as it were, inherited them. It's just teetering on the whimsical. Oh dear. Wilson impressed himself. The chief merit of Brithdir is that it is personal. I have no hesitation in saying that what is done at Brithdir must live because it has come out of my own life. Very romantic, very egotistical view of architecture as art, not a profession. And besides, if I had done any ordinary thing, everybody would have accepted it. Going your own way, personal, individual, do what you want to do. Wilson went on to greater things. This is St. Bartholomew Brighton, built in 1872 for Father Arthur Wagner, fabulously wealthy. His family made a fortune out of hats. And the architect was a local man, Edmund Scott, and Wagner told him to build high, 42 metres to the roof ridge, reputedly the highest parish church roof ridge in England. In 1895, a new vicar, Arthur Cox, arrived. Vast congregations worshipped at splendid services, augmented from 1896 by a permanent orchestra and conducted to their seats by a Japanese verger, John Kendo Fudikichi, who had once worked in the stables of the Mikado. Cox not only wanted the church furnished extravagantly, but wanted to extend it. In the apse, there was to be an enormous mosaic, the Madonna in glory, about 10 meters high. It didn't happen. Henry Wilson's work on the interior was spread over 13 years. This crucifix on the Lady Altar of 1902, with a silver-plated copper repoussé frontal of the Adoration of the Magi, rather different in tone from that at Brithdir. In 1911, Father Cox went over to Rome, and Wilson's involvement with the church ceased. Sometimes you come across arts and crafts ideas in unexpected places. This is St. Matthew, Buckley and Flint. It's a church by John Douglas, who's not a member of the Art Workers Guild, not a member of the Northern Art Workers Guild. He was architect to the Duke of Westminster, and he built a lot of central Chester. This black and white is rather idiosyncratic, but typical of him. An 1821 church, the only commissioner's church in Wales, was more or less rebuilt by Douglas and his then partner, Charles Howard Minshall. There were new vestries, a remodelled chancel and tower, and a new nave, and the Lich Gate was added in 1901. The new porch on the right was in memory of John Ruskin. How interesting, a porch to a church in memory of John Ruskin, 1902. There we are, there's the plaque to prove it. These are the doors from the porch into the baptistry, which of course look like doors in a theatre or a cinema. And that red cross, I don't know why, but I always think that looks a bit like a nonconformist church. I don't know what that means, but it's one of those odd things that you observe. This is, again, it's different from what the Gothic were doing. The baptistry is in memory of Catherine Gladstone, wife of William Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister. It was stenciled and painted by William Frank Lodge, designed by Douglas. Again, this could all be Burgess or Bodley. Lodge later worked with the director of Watts & Co. This is the ceiling of the baptistry. This is the font, and this is the window by Henry Holiday. So you're coming out now of the baptistry into the church. That's looking back to the baptistry. There's the Holiday window in the distance. So structurally, the church is conservative and rather unexciting. The font cover is by Herbert Reed, member of the Art Workers Guild, later in 1926. And he also made the altar rail, credence table, litany desk, bishop's chair, prayer desk, and possibly the choir stalls and this rather butch pulpit. But the reredos, no devotional central image, the altar furniture, the large candlesticks in the sanctuary, the surviving riddle post element, and the prayer board were designed and made by Robert Hilton, who was later director of the Keswick School of Industrial Arts. Harry Drew, incumbent from 1897, was Gladstone's son-in-law, and much of the work in the church was paid for by the Gladstones. But it is the timber frame panels below the clerestory windows that give character. They are the Beatitudes, designed by Minshull in 1910, painted by Robert John Ellis and his brother Henry in partnership in Chester. Again, this is a church with art rather overwhelming religion. Now, the Methodist Chapel in Long Street, Middleton, by Edgar Wood of 1899 to 1901. So again, absolutely on the 1900 button. Edgar Wood's a hero in Middleton, but he didn't travel far, so his fame has not either. The supporters of his Middleton Wesleyan Church in 2014 registered their website as artsandcraftschurch.org, and they go so far as to call their church the Arts and Crafts Church on their website's opening page. I was rather shy about suggesting that there might be others. Edgar Wood was the first secretary of the Northern Artworkers Guild, which was founded by Walter Crane in 1896. And his other churches demonstrated a wide range of approaches and readiness to address any spiritual agenda. This is Temple Street Baptist Church of 1889, now a nursery. This is the interior of Old Row Unitarian Church in Middleton of 1892, torn down in 1965. I wonder who gave that approval. This is Silver Street Chapel in Rochdale, which when I went to see it was closed and for sale. This is one of those churches which you think, well, this is really a European church. What's it doing in Rochdale? It should be in Northern Italy or in Austria somewhere. And famously, the first Church of Christ Scientist at Victoria Park, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. I think that's for another evening. Long Street is stylistically close to all the sorts of devices that Mackintosh employed at the Glasgow School of Art, and to some extent at Queen's Cross School too, but rather less exaggerated, because Wood was far too grounded to be a spook. But the several foundation stones, which of course nonconformist churches have, you can see them in situ there, are carved in this very stylish, stylized way. I don't think you see that anywhere else at all. Inside, the bronze figures on the font are by Thomas Sterling Lee, member of the Artworkers Guild in 1889, and the pulpit figure is reportedly his as well. Again, we're a long way from the Gothic revival. The glass in the doors is Mackintosh's spirit, if not in fact, Glasgow roses. Middleton is captured in the inscription on steps leading up to Jubilee Park in Middleton. Who works not for his fellows starves his soul. His thoughts grow poor and dwindle, and his heart grudges each beat as misers do the dole. The cooperative spirit, good fellowship was very important. Now, as you'll see, also it's Brockhampton, which many people say, oh, that is the Arts and Crafts Church. The first one they mention, that or Sloane Street, Trinity Sloane Street is the first one they mention. And you see it's at more or less the same time as Middleton. Pevsner was dazzled by this church. He called Brockhampton expressionist and acknowledged its originality. It was built for an American heiress, Alice Madeline Jordan. Her millionaire father founded the largest department store in Boston, Massachusetts. Madeline chose as her architect W.R. Letherby, from 1896, head of Central School of Arts and Crafts, and its principal from 1902. And in 1900, appointed first professor of design at the Royal College of Art. He was a real lion. She was a lion hunter, and she caught Letherby. Like any good arts and craftsman, Letherby wanted to use local men and materials. Alas, they did not come up to scratch. And in the end, the woodwork was executed by Letherby's Central School colleague, George Jack, who was in the Artworkers Guild from 1906. Letherby himself designed the font, and he designed and carved the pulpit. The metalwork was produced locally. The door hinges are by the Brockhampton blacksmith. The windows are all by Christopher Wall, another Artworkers Guild member, who designed the windows in the Lady Chapel of Gloucester Cathedral. The impact of Brockhampton is both sweetly homely and mildly unsettling. I have called it rather rashly elsewhere, psychedelic chocolate box. Yes, it can be seen as epitomizing a 20th century view of a perfect English country church, but it can also be interpreted as a ragbag of eclecticism, a pastiche of little old England and faintly ridiculous. Pevsner wrote, "At first sight, the tourist might accept the church as Gothic, but for all I know, it is original. Though welcoming and numinous, it seems to express a spirit which is not especially religious, let alone Christian. Letherby was not a Christian, and Mrs. Foster, who paid for it, was not a churchgoer." St. Mary the Virgin in Great Whalley, this rather humdrum exterior, all simplicity and humility, gives little hint of the interior. Here is no restraint whatever. It is so decorative as to be almost more distracting than spiritual. It gives the lie again to the idea that arts and crafts is about simplicity. It's built for a stockbroker, Evelyn Heseltine, in memory of his younger brother. Heseltine chose the designer of the fittings, William Reynolds Stevens, before he decided on the architect. The apsidal ceiling is aluminium foil, as dear as silver in 1902. Oxidized aluminium ribs support the nave roof with lilies rising from bulbs. The brass chancel screen has more roses with small silvered angels. The organ case has bas-relief panels of animals from the Benedicite. Magnify him forever. At the east end, Christ stands above the altar in a robe of oxidized silver with a mother of pearl clasp, posed dramatically against a black marble vine. His heart is ruby glass. Great Whalley is very much a church of the material world. The handmade here, not so much honest, joyful and simple as expensive. The church is brazenly dedicated to costliness. Something so glorious, so fashionable, was bound to attract attention. Ideas are free and easily stolen and used by commercial hands who care not a fig for ideals and even ideas. George Baines and Son, who built 250, maybe more, nonconformist, mainly Methodist churches in this period. This is Muswell Hill, now a pub. Well, it was a pub when I went to see it in 2018. This is Breachwood Baptist Church, Kingswood. And this is Rugby, the Baptist Chapel at Rugby of 1905. You think, well, these are all, they're kind of taking the mickey. They're artsy craftsy looking, but they've got nothing to do with arts and crafts because Baines was not interested. He just wanted facades that looked fashionable, that looked modern. But when you go inside, this is the inside of Rugby, and look at the detail, actually you begin to think it's not as easy as that. Look at the tops on the pulpit. These are Voisey hearts, are they? Green, blue enamel. And what about this? This is the bench end in the gallery. This is not just casual facadism. This is something rather interesting and felt. It's the arts and crafts ideas of art have begun to imbue everybody who's doing architecture, who's doing church architecture. It's difficult not to be artsy craftsy by this period. Now we're going to move forward to the 1920s and see what happened next. Arts and crafts, bashful and shy, creeping out like a self-effacing, self-conscious lamb. This is St Andrew Harrow Road in Sudbury by W. Charles Weymouth, a Gothic church with knowing arts and crafts detail. Weymouth is rather a retiring figure. He had an instinct for nostalgia and old England, which is what St Andrews is, a faint dwindling echo of a dying arts and crafts ethos. The glass is Edwardian pub glass, not handmade, I think, and I suspect, oh horror, from a catalogue. There's no suggestion that it was built in an Art Workers Guild way, or Arts and Crafts way, nor was Weymouth a member of the Art Workers Guild. But in the detail, there's a loving attention to detail, pride in the small scale, a slightly self-mocking nostalgia, I think, modesty in materials and ambition. It's perhaps fake, but fake in that way, like the half-timbering of the Liberty store in Regent Street. It's sincerely meant, but tinged with nostalgia. Now arts and crafts in the service of not merely copying, but full-blown romantic indulgence, theatre even. St Eloi Llaneloi in Pembrokeshire by John Coates Carter, 1924. It hunkers down against the elements, seems to have almost no windows. In 1924, it was just fragments of stone in a field. These are photographs in the church. As you can see, they've slightly suffered, but that's what there was when Coates Carter got going. The original church, said Coates Carter, would appear to be perhaps 12th century, but it is difficult to assign dates in a building that has no architectural details. How very true. He stated his intention was to take care to preserve every vestige of old work in its original position. He was aiming for the church as what is most likely was at the beginning of the 16th century. But why? The impetus seems to have come from the Archdeacon of St. David's, David Lewis Prosser. St. David's is just 7 miles from Llandello. Prosser was a vigorous anti-Catholic. He believed the Anglican Church was the true Church of Wales and that Roman clergy and nonconformist ministers are intruders. There may be historical excuse for their being here, but we cannot recognize their right to be here. It is likely that Prosser's influence got Coates Carter the job. He was also an Anglo-Catholic. What's more, the Anglican Church was disestablished in Wales in 1920. So from the Archdeacon's point of view, Llandello was a sort of ecclesiological political statement, a pre-Reformation Welsh church, a proper church, boldly reconstructed in the teeth of disestablishment, and all a very long way from Welsh nonconformity. What Coates Carter built was a sort of Welsh rhapsody, a dream of low stone walls, rugged lonesomeness, dim light, mystery and glamour. It's a wonderfully theatrical experience as you gently rise from west to east, which a pre-Reformation church would have been. The altar is surmounted by a Jesuit reredos, such as no church before 1920 could possibly have possessed. The doll-like figure of Christ was probably made and painted by Coates Carter himself, a very arts and crafts thing, designer and maker, devotional too, and rather sophisticatedly naive. It takes a new intelligence to move away, something which has that same spirit of delight in the handmade, but with utterly new language. And this is Our Lady in St. Alphege in Bath by Giles Gilbert Scott. He's certainly not arts and crafts. Or is he just on the outer limits? And this is another architect who sometimes is and sometimes isn't. This is Ernest Sherman's Church of St. Francis of Assisi in Isleworth. He's using the vocabulary of arts and crafts, expressed joints. You can see what's going on. There's no pretense. Glazing very similar to what you see in the work J.D. Sedding and Henry Wilson. And this gallery front, well, is it arts and crafts? Is it modern? It's quite hard to pin down what it is. And finally, I'm going to finish with an aesthetic which seems neither arts and crafts nor modernist, a church at the end of things, perhaps. It's St. James and St. Basil Fenham in Newcastle upon Tyne by Eric Edward Lofting, 1927 to 32. Sir James Knott had the church built as a memorial to 2 of his sons killed in the Great War. Lofting had served in the war and fought at the Somme. He was by this time assistant to the surveyor to Westminster Abbey, working with and recommended by Letherby, then the surveyor of the Abbey. The craftsmen had all come late to the Artworkers Guild and were all old by this time. The presiding genius was Letherby, now venerable. He advised Lofting and drew together the artist craftsmen. Letherby died in 1931, before the church was completed. 5 of the large windows are by Edward Woor, who was Artworkers Guild from 1919, and he'd been a pupil of Christopher Ward, so there's a continuity there. The rest are by George Jack, who'd been an Artworkers Guild member since 1906 and had did the woodwork, if you may remember, at Brockhampton we saw earlier on. This is only designed for stained glass, and he was unfamiliar with it, and so he was greatly helped by Woor, who knew his way around. There's an octopus, whales, storks, and mountain goats, and Jack died before the work was completed. George Jack also designed the original crystal chandeliers, electroliers really, and seems to have been responsible for much of the detailing of the external stonework and the enormous clock. The carved woodwork, including this inlaid altar table, was all designed by George Jack. The pierced organ screen has the unintended air of the seraglio, even more the screen at the east end of the south aisle. Much of the carving was by another Art Workers Guild man, Lawrence Turner, who was nearly 70 when the carving was done. The altar plate, which I can't show you because I didn't see it, was designed by John Paul Cooper, who was Art Workers Guild from 1908 and who died the year after this church was consecrated. And another veteran, Graylie Hewitt, who was Art Workers Guild from 1903, who was also just about 70, lettered these 10 commandments on the north aisle panelling. And so it ends with something like defiance and assertion by a generation coming to an end, the arts and crafts generation coming to an end. The Arts and Crafts Church was perhaps in 1932 over. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Alec, for that amazingly rich tour around, well, the British Isles, really, and that extraordinary collection of images that we've seen. I don't know, I think you'd said you'd got hundreds of slides. I thought it was hyperbole.
No, 411.
Yes, now I see it wasn't hyperbole after all. So thank you. And while I'm starting the conversation going, if you have any questions, and I'm sure you have, there are many of you out there, and I know many of you are experts in this particular period, then please put them in the Q&A box and I will moderate them as they come through. But while we're waiting for people to do that, I mean, I've got lots and lots of questions. I'm not a specialist in this area at all. And I can see that, that you've got this category of the Arts and Crafts Church. And clearly you're presenting it as a stylistic category. And I wondered, because whether you also could say something about whether it's a political or an ideological category, whether, or, you know, you indicated that there was something about chronology in it. But I just wondered if you got any contexts for these, because I know it's such a huge survey, but is this, given that they are so stylistically diverse, are there some overarching concepts that you can pull out that tie them together as this Arts and Crafts Church?
Yes, there's a kind of profound problem in the arts and crafts, which is people think that arts and crafts looks like something. So the notion that it's a style is very prevalent amongst people, architectural historians. But the reality of it is that it's not to do with the way things look. It's to do with the way things are made and the spirit in which they're made. And the Art Workers Guild was about people getting together to understand how things were made, to share ideas, not like the competitive, you know, Gilbert Scott versus Streeton versus Butterfield. They worked together, and they wanted to be companionable and friendly and supportive. So the political dimension is it's social democratic. They are concerned with each other. They want the world to be a better place. They want there to be equality between master and man. The craftsman and the designer should be the same person, or if they're not the same person, they should be very friendly and they should get on with each other. They should trust each other. They should not be a hierarchy, all of those kind of things. Out of that comes things which are individual, and one strives to see a coherence and a consistency. But the whole point is they want to be individual, so they don't want to copy. They don't want things to look like everything else. However, if you read the first 4 chapters of my book, you will see this set out very clearly and rather cogently, that subsequently in the 1970s, we start seeing arts and crafts as a style. Gillian Naylor's book in 1970 says design sources, and kind of creates this canon of what arts and crafts things are, which has got stuck. And we're constantly kind of having to undo that and say it's not about the way things look, it's about the way things are made and how the people involved interacted with each other. So that's where the similarity lies. They all trust each other, they all work together, they all have the same, they all kind of point in the same direction, but it's a very individual direction, and they're very idiosyncratic, and they are very reluctant to do the same as each other. They want it to be new and original and fresh.
So you're very much emphasising the arts and the crafts, and perhaps later on we'll talk about that craftsmanship and the role of the craftsman and the artist. And you use the sort of term periodically, you say, oh, this was a bit arty or so on. So maybe you could say a bit more about that. But in terms of, I just wondered, what strikes me is that maybe there is a rejection, that they are confessionally extremely diverse, aren't they? From nonconformists of really very low church to really quite high Anglican.
Well,
but it's a rejection of a kind of the ecclesiology of the is it a social rejection, I suppose?
Well, the point, I think the main point is that by 1880, you don't have to believe in God anymore. You can be an atheist, and Philip Webb is an atheist, and Letherby is pretty much, well, he's a pantheist. You know, he claims to be a low church Anglican, but actually he's a pantheist of some kind. And I have done some work on the religious affiliations of the architects, and the answer is most of them don't say, but very few of them are committed churchgoers. Spooner is an exception. The nonconformists, on the whole, try and use architects who are members of their congregations. You know, so the Baptists look for Baptist architects and Unitarians look for Unitarian architects. But the Anglicans, insofar as they are committed themselves, the clients who are paying for it, they look for the best architect, the architect they can either afford or the one that's fashionable. And the architects don't have a commitment to churches as machines for worship again, because on the whole, they don't worship. I mean, it's a curious thing that if you build a church in 1830, 1840, the chances are you go to that church, you go to church and you subscribe to 39 articles and you buy all that. By 1880, you could be an atheist, an agnostic, a pantheist, a theosophist. It doesn't affect the fact that you can make a church, because a church is a work of art. Now, arts and crafts is a phrase that was invented for the exhibition. There was a discussion of what they should call the exhibition in 1889, and decorative art was quite a strong contender, the decorative arts exhibition. But arts and crafts, which was suggested by T.J. Cobden Sanderson, won because people felt it was a catch-all, and it was rather nice to have the ampersand in, because it conjoined these two things. We, the artists, the architects, and you, the guys, the masons and the wood carvers and all that, we're together because it's an ampersand. But it's the Arts and Crafts Society, not the Crafts and Arts Society. So there is still a pecking order between the artists, who are very keen not to be professionals, by the way. There's a whole debate about, is architecture an art or profession? And these guys are very keen to be artists, but they want to be equal with and admire and respect their craftsmen. The artiness, I think, comes out of the clients wanting things to look right. So Brockhampton, you can see that Mrs. Foster is very keen that it should look like the latest, hippest church you could possibly have. And that happens in other churches as well. I talk about that in the book. There's a sense of kind of fashion, and that slightly undermines the sincerity of the churches, I think. Long answer.
That these are essentially, what you seem to be suggesting is that they are, I mean, churches have many, many functions, and I've got lots of questions here, so I'm not going to go on anymore. But well, I was interested in planning that, and what you seem to be suggesting is that many of these are actually places for social display or congregation, but not necessarily for, you used the word numinous once. But
yes, well, they are. There are some that are deliberately built like that. The one I showed very briefly, Lutchen's Church at Pixham, is deliberately designed to work as a hall and a church, and the chancel is divided off by a curtain, which is still in place. So, and that notion that there is a social dimension to Christianity is very powerful. It happens at Hazelmere too. There's a notion in which Jesus becomes a kind of social worker, and the elaboration of ceremonial in church services is on the decline, and people, they don't want to be brought to their knees anymore. They want to be together and have fellowship and those kind of things, and that is in many of the churches. A lot of them, of course, are built to show off. They're built as it were private chapels. The church at Matlock by Guy Dorber is very much a private private chapel. The church of Brockhampton is really a private chapel, insofar as it's entirely built by the Foster money, and she doesn't go to church, as far as her great-grandson was able to tell me.
So it's, well, no, I'm not going to say any more here. You can see there are lots and lots of questions coming in. First of which is from Neil Jackson. Hello, Neil.
Hello, Neil Jackson. Do I get to see people's pictures, faces?
To see, no. Philip Webb, St Martin, Brampton, dates from 1877, the same year that he and Morris founded SPAB. I would argue, says Neil, that the obvious incompleteness of the church, whether in plan or elevation, and the chronological confusion of the various elements, older style windows being used above and therefore newer than the newer style windows used below, is intended to demonstrate the SPAB belief that it is all right for a building to be both incomplete and an accumulation of parts over a length of time, even though this building was built all at once to a complete design. The same argument can be made about Webb's Standen, as we saw, as Anne Stutchbury introduced us to last week. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that idea of that creation of a kind of a palimpsest.
Well, Neil has absolutely classically asked an extremely complicated question to which there's not one straightforward answer. However, the SPAB notion that you should be honest about showing the difference between what's old, what's new, what you've replaced, what you've added, seems like it runs contradictory to the notion that you build a one-off church which includes things that look like they're older and look like they're newer. But that happens a lot. Brockhampton is full of things. There are relieving arches put in by Letherby which have no function whatever. They're put in to look like the church has some longer history. That I think it's a problem when you're trying to incorporate a theory into building a church, which is not a religious theory, then I think you're up against a problem. But I'm not an expert on Brampton, I must say, nor an expert on Webb. And what Neil's saying may well be true. But I think that notion that you are honest about what you're doing when you're building is easy to say, but quite hard to do. I don't think I've answered the question. It wasn't really a question. It was a kind of a statement, and I'm not sure I totally got it.
I suppose it's inviting you to consider the relationship to the relationship of the designers and commissioners of the Arts and Crafts Church to history, to architectural history, and to ecclesiastical history.
Well,
you're talking about different historical styles being included. And I don't know what you think about that, whether because you talked about modernity a bit as well, so. Well,
one must be very careful not to generalize, because different architects have different ideas. But on the whole, they are not keen on the idea of copying something which was a perfect original from the Middle Ages. You know, they're not interested in middle pointed. That's not their idea at all. They are interested in taking suggestions, hints from what went before and using it in a new way. They want to be seen to know what they're doing, but not to copy what went before. And that's a difficult thing to achieve. It's one of the reasons why the churches are so disparate. If you try and apply a rigid theoretical structure to what they're doing, you come unstuck, because they're not consistent. You can't be. You can't look at a church like Brockhampton or Holy Trinity Sloane Street and say this expresses a complete coherent theoretical view about architecture or indeed religion, because it's not working like that.
Well, I suppose in a sense that's really the heart of it, isn't it? Because what you've done is you've presented a huge category and a sort of survey. Yeah, but actually it's the individual detail, the context of those that help shape an understanding of each specific.
I've got to be very careful. I said in my VICSOC talk, one of the things I talk about is a category that defies categorization. It's not interested in categorization, it resists categorization, doesn't want to be categorized. And categorization is a very Victorian idea, and they're trying to fight against that. They don't want to be seen as a pigeonhole. And the temptation that we all have now is to try and make it a nice rigid grid. This is one in, this is not in, this is definitely like this is not like this. It doesn't work like that. They are being individual, and if confronted by the notion that they are a particular kind of church, they would object. They wouldn't want to be seen.
You can see the circularity there, can't you? Then, because the whole point is that your book is called The Arts and Crafts Church. So
well, I have to call it something. I have to call it something. The idea there is something called the Arts and Crafts Church is very hard to undo. My very first talk to VICSOC was called The Arts and Crafts Church, Does It Exist? Because it's a convenient, it sounds like something that exists. Arts and Crafts Church, Arts and Crafts Furniture, Arts and Crafts Jewelry. It sounds like it's something that exists. And if you say to somebody, what's an Arts and Crafts Church? They will say, oh, I know, Holy Trinity Sloane Street, Brockhampton, Kempley, Roker. Those are the ones people say. And they say it's not. And they say, well, in what way is it an Arts and Crafts Church? Okay, so in my book, I set out the 8 parameters which I have used to decide whether things are in or out. Now, they're arbitrary. I invented them. One of the things is you ought to be a member of the Art Workers Guild, but there are lots of churches that fit around 1900 which are not built by members of the Art Workers Guild. Percy Hale and Curry, John Douglas, perfectly good churches that you can see with arts and crafts spectacles. And I think the notion that it's a category is kind of, it's a boojum. It doesn't work that way. I think I write about that in the article in Architectural Historian.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and get, there are a lot of questions here. Some of them aren't questions so much as points of fact. There's somebody called Chris who says, great talk, thanks. Question, were the late arts and crafts architects at all aware of or influenced by developments in European church architecture?
Yeah. What's happening at this moment is that there's this huge outburst of information. There are magazines, there are journals, people are traveling, people are in touch with each other, they're going to Turin, they're going to Paris, they're going to America. It's impossible to not know what's going on. By 1905, you can't really build a church without knowing what other churches are being built at the same time elsewhere. The question is whether you buy into that, whether you kind of go along with it, where you say, oh no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do something different. So I think there's great awareness. I think particularly of what's going on in America, and certainly what's going on in Europe. I cannot sit down and say that church shows the influence of that church because I haven't studied Europe. But I'm sure it's true.
Could I jump in with a quick question, please, Anne-Marie, which is about empire, and whether the architects that you've been looking at and who are designing churches are also producing works in colonies and dominions of the empire, and or whether there are architects operating in the colonies and dominions designing churches using the same, I suppose, social critique that underpins these. I'm trying to resist saying arts and crafts church, as you can tell, but
very good. No, the answer is yes. And some famous examples where Schultz designed Khartoum Cathedral, which still stands. Herbert Baker, who built 2 or 3 churches in Britain, was very active in South Africa. And there's a lot of work now on empire churches. Whether they necessarily reflect the same set of ideas, I don't know, because I haven't done the work. My supervisor said, don't do Ireland, it's too complicated. Don't do America, it's too big. Don't do Europe, you need a book for every country. So I said, okay, I'll do England, Scotland, Wales. That'll be enough for 100,000 words, and it was. So my book is still only England, Scotland, Wales, and I don't make any pretense to, the only thing I ever say is, I know there are none in Iceland. That's all I can tell you. But as far as the empire is concerned, I know there are churches in Canada, Australia, one of the architects who's kind of on the periphery of this, John Hawes, who built a church at Gunnerton in Northumbria, he went to Australia and built churches. He went to the West Indies and built churches. I haven't looked at those, but my suspicion is some of the ideas are going to carry over to other countries. But of course, in other countries, they're going to feel and look different because they're other countries.
Yes, though perhaps the influence is not necessarily unidirectional. Maybe points of reciprocity. Anyway, thank you.
Well, you're right, but that's a point far too subtle for me.
Well, broadening the discussion out, there are a couple of questions here that look at those broader contexts in which we might understand these churches. Claire Price, first of all, says, thank you, Alex. Fascinating and masterful. I won't tackle you on St. Alphege, Bath publicly, so she can leave that for another time.
Well, you'll notice I didn't say very much about it.
Okay. I was wondering if your research pulled out evidence of the cost of these elaborate schemes and if the changing funding situation after the First World War might be partially to blame for the decline of the elaborate arts and crafts production in churches, lack of sympathetic benefactors, for example. So that's the influence of the war. And I saw down here, Campbell Watterson says the decline of the arts and crafts church appears to coincide with the growth of Anglo-Catholicism in the 1900s to 1930s. And was that a coincidence? So on the one hand, we've got war, and on the other hand, we've got the confessional context.
Okay, well, the war, I think, means that some churches become memorializing, and the money, people with money are less inclined to build churches after 1920. And I don't know, I can't say that's because of the war. It's because people didn't buy the whole God thing in the same way as they did in 1850. I do not think it's easy to draw these kind of simplistic relationships between this happened and therefore that happened. I think it's infinitely more complicated and layered and textured than that. Anglo-Catholicism, I think a lot of the Anglican churches that I've looked at have definitely got Anglo-Catholic clients and an Anglo-Catholic inclination, sometimes because they're rejecting the low church of their local parish. For example, at Low Marple, which is a church that John Danderseding started and Henry Wilson finished, that was definitely built by the patron because she did not approve of the low church in Marple. Whether that's in decline, if Anglo-Catholicism is in decline after 1920, I haven't really looked at that many churches after 1920. It's possible, but it's certainly a very important force in church building, Anglican church building, before the war. The war, we are told the war reduces the availability of craftsmen to do the specialist work. I certainly think it reduces the amount of money to pay for churches, but I think also there's a decline in the desire to build a church. It's a crazy thing to be doing in 1880 anyway. Britain's full of churches. There are far too many churches, and they go on being built. Think of Bethnal Green, rammed with churches. They're built because people want to build churches, because that's the thing you do. You can't buy an aeroplane or a West Indian island. You know, you've got to do something with your money, and at that time that's what you do. By 1920 you could do all kinds of other things. You know, you go to Monaco and buy a nice yacht or go to the movies. Life has changed so much that building a church, I think by 1920, seems extremely eccentric thing to do if you're an Anglican. If you're a Catholic, that's an entirely different matter.
So Rosemary Yallop says,
hello, Rosemary.
Yeah, hello, Rosemary. In both the precursor churches, Loesche, Wreay, and those of the principal period, if I can call it that, I'm struck by the naturalistic imagery in the stonework and its resemblance to that found in Byzantine design. Is there any particular explanation for the appeal of this style for these 19th and 20th century architects? So again, this is looking at broader influences.
Yeah, no, I think the Byzantine is important. Weirschultz and Jimson spent, Will Schultz is and Sidney Barnsley are paid by Freshfield to go off to Greece and look at early churches, and they come back with a lot of knowledge and publish a rather good book about Byzantine. So it's in the air. There are a lot of Byzantine influenced churches in Birmingham, because Letherby, who was very influential in Birmingham, was interested in the Byzantine and kind of promulgates that idea as a way you might make churches. I think there's a notion that people see something and they copy it. They see a bit of Byzantine naturalistic animal carving and they say, we'll do that. I don't think it works that way at all. I think what they're saying is we can be free. We can do something which is not mannered, it's not generalized. We can do real birds and real trees and real whales. And if you go to Welbeck Abbey, which is not a church I've talked about this evening, in the choir stalls there, the Benedicite is these are Henry Wilson panels, are verse by verse, there are all the animals. And similarly at Llanfairphlygedin, the Hayward Sumner, they are interested in doing realistic things. I think it's got nothing to do with Byzantium at all, although Byzantine is is growing, as lots of things are growing. People are interested in Japanese originals as well. You know, that remark about the church in Brighton. There's all kinds of things coming into people's design lives, and I don't think you can say if A then B. It just doesn't work that way. That's not the way creative people think.
So that kind of eclecticism, and you at one point I think you kind of rejected it, or you describing it and saying it's not really eclectic. But if we turn to the figure of the craftsperson, then does that have some kind of role in their individual expression? I have a question here from Stephen Hughes, who says, in arts and crafts stained glass, I've noticed a dramatic shift from the period before, where suddenly the craftspeople are art school trained instead of following apprenticeships, at least for the leading figures. Is there any similar change in the training or background of the architects? Because obviously that's the information that they're drawing on, or the education that they're drawing on.
Well, I'm not an expert in glass, and I deliberately tried to avoid glass in the book because Peter Cormack did a fantastic book on arts and crafts glass, and I didn't really want to repeat that. And also glass tends to come later, tends not to be designed by the architect, and I was interested in the architectural contribution, you know, who's designing it, who's building it. The glass is a whole nother area. However, the observation that there's a change from apprenticeships to school, I think applies. I'm not sure it applies in architecture in quite the same way, because people are still in offices learning at people's knees and being given junior jobs to do. It's very difficult to learn to be an architect without being in an architectural practice, and that's still true now. I think you can do a degree, but you've got to wind up, you know, on the board doing real work. And I certainly can't see a moment when it changes, when the way the architecture changes because of the way the education changes. Because again, it's art, and it doesn't work that way. I don't know how long I have to say this, that the way in which creative people work, and this is a period in which creative people are allowed to be encouraged to want to be free and do their own thing and do it their own way. They don't want to be seen to be ignorant. They don't want to be naive, but they want to be seen to know what they're doing, but they want to do it their own way. They don't follow, you know, tram lines. They when they see something which is predictable or structured, they want to break out of it and do something different. It's very difficult for me to keep on harping on about this, but you know, having worked in advertising, I know that people don't think that way. They don't think like academics. You know, if you're creative, you don't think like an academic. Oh, here is a medieval cathedral. I'm going to do something kind of like that. No, it doesn't work that way. You don't even know what you're stealing from most of the time. You've taken in all kinds of stuff, all kinds of ideas, and you regenerate it in a new way, as if you were Picasso. That's kind of what it's like.
Well, I think, Alec, that's an extraordinary point on which we must maybe draw things to a close. There's still a huge number of questions and observations which you'll be able to see on the in the chat box afterwards. But I think at this point, having given us such a very rich talk, that we probably need to let you go and refresh yourself with a large beer or.
Anne-Marie, how do I see the chat box?
If you hover over your screen, you can see the Q&A box actually.
Oh, the Q&A box. Okay, so okay.
But I think probably it's 7:30, and we maybe should.
No, that's okay. I will type answer to these. Bobby Drake, he's always asking me a question. Okay, he's got me an answer for that one. That's fine. I will deal with those, and I will go on typing until I fall asleep.
Alec, perhaps you could just share your email address so people could email in their questions if they have them.
Okay. Well, there's a special email in the book, and for the VicSoc I wouldn't reveal it. I said you've got to buy the book before you get my email, but I'm going to break that rule this evening. And if you've all got your pencils and papers ready, I will tell you what it is. It is Alec Hamilton Churches, all one word. Alec Hamilton Churches, Alec with a C, by the way, not an X. Alec Hamilton Churches, all one word, at outlook.com, and that will get to me. But I will answer these. I will type answers to these now. There are 15.
Alec, Grace has kindly put the your email address in the chat box, which all the participants can see.
She put that new address that I've just given you? She has. Okay.
If you
so what's the best way for me to proceed then? Answer these now?
No, the best way, I think, is for people to email you with their comments and questions subsequently, and you can conduct.
But they've got to do it all again, and here they are, and I could do it in half an hour. Let me do.
I also have a life. I can't keep on.
You mean if I do it, you can't switch off?
Correct.
So you want to go and have supper? Well, I can't blame you. Sorry, you get enthused about these things. You want to do them. So what you're saying is we want to leave the show, and then I will deal with emails that they will send me to that address I've given you. And if they repeat the question, I'll deal with it that way. Is that what you're saying?
Very generous of you to do that. Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Because I'm happy to do that. So am I saying good night?
You are, and
Bye-bye.
So am I. And thank you very much, everybody who's still staying around. Alec does have a book out, as you will have gathered. There is a discount code which you can apply when you order it from Lund Humphreys. I'm sure it'll make a fabulous addition to your library, or indeed a Christmas present to your libraries. Okay, thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.